of your great name, Jesus. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain for us, Son of God and man. You are high and lifted up, and all the world will praise your great name. All the weak find their strength at the sound of your great name. Hungry souls receive grace at the sound of your great name. The fatherless, they find their rest at the sound of your great name. The sick are healed and the dead are raised at the sound of your great name, Jesus. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain for us, Son of God and man. You are high and lifted up, and all the world will praise your great name, your great name. Redeemer, my healer, Lord Almighty, my Savior, defender, you are my King. Redeemer, my healer, Lord Almighty, my Savior, defender, you are my King, Jesus. The name of Jesus. You are high and lifted up, and all the world will praise your great Jesus.
Well, good evening. I am glad to be with all of you tonight. I hope everyone is doing well. We're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 10. Revelation chapter 10 tonight. That is a tough passage. And so we're going to do our best with it. It is good to see those of you that are on here. Judging by our little viewer number, though, it sure looks an awful lot like the daylight savings time has got a lot of people doing something other than watching with us tonight. So just one more reason to oppose the time tax on us. Oh, well, good to see people just hopping on right now, so glad to have all of you here. If you have any prayer requests, then please go ahead and share those prayer requests, and I'd love to lift those up with you. Let me tell you what I know about let me see, I had Sister Sherry Brown's brother passed away, and his funeral was today. I'd really hoped to make it, but had a conflict, was not able to. It was at 10 this morning, and I thought I would be ready to be there in time, and was not. But I think Brother Ben was able to go, so keep her in your prayers. Let's see. What other prayer requests do you all have? I don't think I have anything else right offhand other than the things we've already been mentioning. Continue to pray for Brother Paul's granddaughter, Haley. She's having some ongoing issues from the infection that she had, where she doesn't have energy, and it's just, I don't remember what it's called, but it's something that can potentially be a lifelong issue. And so be in prayer for her as well as Brother Paul is facing knee surgery coming up. So be in prayer for him, that they'll be able to do that and take care of him. Any other prayer requests that you all have, I would love to hear. Okay, Sister Vicky says, my friend Eric Durr passed away and his funeral is Friday. So we certainly want to be in prayer for that family as well. Continue to pray for my grandpa Jake. Obviously still on hospice with lung cancer, having the difficulty breathing increasing. So be in prayer for him to be comfortable. As an announcement, Brother Bobby Sparks is at Unity in Richwood this week. He'll be there tomorrow night and Friday night as well. He does a series of presentations on the typology of the tabernacle. He's got a little mock-up of the tabernacle that you can see that I think would be really interesting. So if you're interested in going down there, they're doing that at 7 o'clock tomorrow night and Friday night. I gave some serious consideration to just going down there tonight and streaming their stream as ours. But I didn't want to, so but I did think about it. I've got an unspoken prayer request for somebody here who's having some family problems, marital problems, and so God knows the details of that, so I ask that you keep them in your prayers. The Sister Susan medical tests continue. She's got a biopsy on Monday afternoon, so we want to pray that that goes well. Okay, and Brother Gary got a lot going on at work, and his new boss started yesterday, so a little anxious about it. So I want to be in prayer for him as well. And David Chapman's a pastor that I know from the Church Answers group that I do some stuff with, that I'm writing this Old Testament survey book for, and so good to have you with us. All right, and pray for Colleen and the kids. They're up in Fredericksburg with her mom and Ronnie this week, so I'm by myself. So if I look emaciated or my clothes are dirty or something, I just want you to know I'm operating in really difficult circumstances. All right, continue to pray for all those that are still looking for employment, and for those that are sick and whatever else is going on. But I don't see any other prayer requests. If not, then I am just going to go ahead and open with the word of prayer, and then we will open up the scripture. Heavenly Father God, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the blessings that you give us, for the privilege that we have of knowing and serving you, God. I thank you that you know the end from the beginning and all these things that we're looking at, and that these tests that people are waiting on, that those that are facing surgery, those that are facing an uncertain prognosis, God, even those that are facing grief, that don't know what life is going to be like going forward, that you do know, and that you are already there, that you give them the strength and the peace that they need. So, Father, now, as we open up your word, I pray that you'd lift these burdens off our hearts, that you'd give us the clarity that we need to be made more like your Son, Jesus, in whose name I pray. Amen. All right, Revelation chapter 10. Let me move everything over here. It is a tough passage. It's a tough passage because it interlays with so much of the Old Testament. There are several passages that we're going to have to bounce around between to get a good feel for what's going on in Revelation chapter 10. And perhaps at the end of that, we may still not have a great feel for what's going on, but I'm going to do my best for you tonight. Revelation chapter 10. Okay, so let's place ourselves again, just so your mind is fresh on where we are. You remember that the book of Revelation begins with the letters to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and that the problems in these 7 churches are basically fall into a handful of categories where they are giving into temptation on one extreme, or they've left their first love on the other extreme of failure, or in the case of a couple of churches, they were faithful. And so John is writing to them on behalf of Jesus to encourage them and also to challenge them to be overcomers, to be victors in this situation that they're facing. Now, when the judgment part of Revelation begins, this vivid vision, it starts out with the 7 seals. There's a scroll that has 7 seals on it, and you remember we talked about this, that in all likelihood, it was sealed with 7 seals like this, and you open part of it, and it opens it, and opens it, and opens it. I argued that this is a reference from Jeremiah. You remember that Jeremiah bought a piece of property before he was carried away into exile, and he buried this sealed scroll. And he did that because he knew that even though he wouldn't return to the land, that ultimately God would return his people to the land. It's like when Jacob died and when Joseph died, and they said, "Take my body to Israel, because I may not be there, but God has promised that his people will be there." And so he gives them this hope. He gives them this picture. And so the 7 sealed scroll, I think, and a lot of commentators think, is the title deed to the world that God has allowed, because we were his representatives, allowed us to, in our sin, hand the world over, and yet he ultimately comes to claim it back, and that's our hope. And so the 7 sealed scroll is opened. And as I've argued, the 7 sealed scroll certainly seems to, for the most part, be humanity gone wild. That God allows us to see what happens when we do what we want to do. And with the 7th seal, then the 7 trumpets begin. The 7 trumpets, in contrast, seem to include a lot more demonic activity, that God is allowing these demons, several of which we read have been restrained, to now unleash their will on the earth. And so you have these burning stars that represent fallen angels. You have these different plagues that are unleashed. Now, again, this is not a tight correlation. So the first angel sounds, and there's hail and fire mingled with blood, which certainly reminds us of the Exodus. And you can see even in the 7 seals, they're not all things that human beings are doing, but that's the general pattern, is that the 7 seals are mostly God saying, "Have it your way," at the beginning of the tribulation. Human evil is restrained by common grace in ways we can't even understand. And so he begins to unleash that. And then, remember, people often ask, why does God allow Satan to go around doing these things? Why doesn't God put a stop to all of it right now? And in fact, when we see that there's these angels that are bound in 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude and here in Revelation, what we find out, I think, is that actually the only reason things are not much, much worse than they are is by the grace of God. He is restraining some of that as well. And so finally, after these 7 trumpets, there are 7 vials in the King James, or 7 bowls of wrath, where rather than God unleashing humanity's evil or the evil of the demons, God is now triumphantly judging sin on the earth. And remember, this cry comes out from the altar. They've got the martyrs under the altar that crowd, "How long, O Lord? How much longer do we have to wait?" And remember, we talked about that seems a little strange, because the altar was the place that people came to cry for mercy. And now from the altar is coming this cry for judgment. The altar of incense was a place where they would pray for God's grace. And yet, remember that you can't have one without the other. That for God to show mercy to the oppressed, he has to execute vengeance on the oppressor. This, to me, is the clearest way to think about when people say, hate the sin but love the sinner. You can't love the sinner without hating the sin. If you've ever seen the effect that alcoholism or drugs have on a person, can you love that person without hating the thing that they're doing? If you were in the 1940s, could you love the Jews without hating the Holocaust? We see that, I think, even in big things. But imagine if you had God's perfect wisdom and God's perfect love, and you looked at the effects of sin. Could you do any less? Could God love the Israelites without cursing the Egyptians? Could God separate those things? And so I think we see God's love and his holiness are not different things, but really different aspects of the same truth, that God is one, and that he is holy and he's righteous, and that in his holy righteousness he provides a way for us to be saved. And yet if we reject that, if he died without mercy under the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses who defied Moses' law, how much worse punishment will befall the one who has trodden over the Spirit of grace? So as we see this, God is unleashing the consequences of our own actions. And so where we are in Revelation 10, we have just seen the first 6 angels have sounded. And you remember when we made this chart before, that between the 6th and 7th judgment, every time there's a pause. There's a heavenly interlude. And so in chapter 10, we're going to see this heavenly interlude of this angel and this book that John's going to eat. It's very strange. And then he's going to measure the temple, and he's going to set out a timeline. Famously, the 2 witnesses are here, and then the 7th angel is going to sound. And so we have this sort of pause in what's going on. And this pause means that next week, when we get into Revelation 11, we're going to be able to say a little bit more about the timeline, about what's happening. And because right now we've just been kind of taking the book as it comes, and there's been very little to help us figure out, okay, where are we in the tribulation? And so all that stuff is going to come together. I'm going to dip my toes in that just a little bit today, but if you're patient, then next week we're going to dig into that pretty deep. So that's the posture of where we are. We are currently in between the 2nd and the 3rd woes. Things are starting to get really intense. Huge portions of the population have died. And probably, if you're looking, you think everything has gone out of control. How much longer can the world take this? And of course, the answer is not long. Jesus said that if it weren't for the elect's sake, no flesh would survive, but he shortens the days for his people. So let's look. I'm going to read this 10th chapter to you. It's only 11 verses long. And then we're going to go and we're going to look at Ezekiel and at Daniel and at Exodus and try to piece together where some of these images are coming from. John writes, "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little book open. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth, and cried with a loud voice, as when a lion roareth. And when he had cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and sware by him that liveth for ever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea, days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets. And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again, and said, Go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel, which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel, and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it, and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand, and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. All right, so what in the world is going on? You see this? There's an angel, and the angel is standing on the border of the sea and the land with 1 foot on each. And this angel cries out, and this description of this angel is incredibly vivid. And then when this angel cries out, there's 7 thunders. And John is about to write down what those 7 thunders are, but then God says, no, not yet. This is a secret. You can't reveal this. And so then this angel gives John a book. And of course, we think of a book as a codex, right, like this. But actually, it's probably a scroll. So he's got this open scroll on his hand. And he says, come and take this and eat it, and it'll make your belly bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. So there's this transition where it goes from sweet to bitter. And then he says, I ate it. And then the angel says to him, you have to prophesy before many people and nations and tongues and kings. He's saying, time's up. This is not going to go on much longer. But then he says, John, in your time, in your moment, you still have more work to do. So there's just so many questions we could ask of this text. And in fact, in the time we have tonight, we're not going to be able to answer everything you might wonder. But let's just go ahead and get started and figure out, how do we live in this tension where God reveals some things to us and not others? How do we live in this tension where he says, look, time's up, and yet there's still work to do? How do we live in this tension where this triumphant figure comes down, stands on the earth and the sea, and we have the promise that will come, and yet we know now that we have not yet seen God's triumphant final victory? How do we pull these things together practically, devotionally, and then also just for understanding the book of Revelation? Okay, so lots of things going on. You can see why I didn't go ahead and go down to the tabernacle thing. I didn't want to sit on this. I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven. All right, let's look at this description of this angel. He's clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was as the sun, and his feet were as pillars of fire. Now, immediately when you're reading this, what starts to come to mind? He comes down from heaven clothed in a cloud. Now, friends, there's only one being that is clothed with clouds in the whole Bible. And maybe you remember who it is. If we went back to, well, actually, you know what we'll do is let's just do that. Let me look up the word cloud here and show this to you. If we go back to Matthew, okay. Matthew 7:15, while he yet spoke, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. This is the Mount of Transfiguration. And while Peter's still speaking and saying, hey, let's build let's build 3 altars, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And while that dumbness is still leaking out of Peter's mouth, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud which said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Hear ye him. Just listen to him. He's not like these others. Now, who's speaking out of this bright? Matthew 24:30. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And of course, this is a direct quote from Daniel. But once again, here's Jesus coming in the clouds. 64. Hereafter shall you see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. 9:7, the Mount of Transfiguration again in Mark. Mark 13:26, the Olivet Discourse again. Mark 14:62, the I am, you shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Luke 9, again, the Mount of Transfiguration. Here's the cloud. Luke 12, so this is not a literal. This is when you see a cloud rise out of the west, you say, here comes a shower. So that's not immediately relevant, although maybe if we looked at it in more detail. But all of that discourse again, you see the Son of Man coming in a cloud. Acts 1:9, when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. When Jesus ascends up to heaven, he's taken up in a cloud. And then what does it say? They're standing there staring, gawking. Oh. And Jesus and the angel says to them, what are you doing standing around staring at the heavens? This same Jesus who went up in the clouds is going to come down in the same way. 1 Corinthians 10:1 and 2, they were in the cloud and all passed through the sea. They were under the cloud. what's the cloud that's represented here? Well, it's the presence of God that led them in a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. 1 Thessalonians 4:17, then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. This is again talking about the return of Christ, and here they're caught up in the clouds with Jesus. Great cloud of witnesses is obviously not the same. Literal clouds there in 2 Peter and Jude. Revelation 1:7, surely you remember this. Behold, he cometh with clouds, and every eye shall see him, and they also which pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. So that now when we get to Revelation 10, and you're familiar with the New Testament, and you're familiar with the Old Testament too, because remember, Ezekiel and Exodus and Daniel are quoted in some of those passages. And then he says, a mighty angel comes down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. That immediately we start to wonder, okay, is this an angel in the normal sense of a messenger? Or is this something like what we ran into a lot in the Old Testament, where the angel of the Lord, the messenger of the Lord, was the Lord himself? So clothed in a cloud, we should immediately at least consider the idea that this is actually Jesus. And then we see a rainbow was upon his head. Where have we seen a rainbow scene? Wasn't it? You remember? Remember when we looked at this throne room in heaven in Revelation 4? He that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone, and there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. Or this is weird. How's a rainbow look like an emerald? And if you remember, the high priest wore a breastplate with 12 stones on it. And so you have the first stone, the last stone on that breastplate, sort of like from A to Z, Alpha and Omega, representing all 12 tribes of Israel, so his covenant with Israel. And an emerald was the fourth stone, and Judah was the fourth-born son of Jacob. And so you have God in the throne room. There's this reminder of his faithful covenants, of his covenant with Israel, of his covenant with creation after the flood, and his covenant with David. And then, of course, you've got the lamb that was slain, representing the new covenant. So it shows God is faithful. He's the same God from Noah up to Christ. But rainbow round the throne. Now, the word rainbow is only used twice in the whole New Testament. A rainbow's around the throne of God here, and now this angel has got a rainbow on his head here. That's certainly interesting as well. His face was as it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. Now, once again, that seems interesting. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. Remember, in the Exodus, they were led by the pillar of cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night. So one last thing before we move on from this. Exodus 19. Led out. He's preparing to come down to Sinai. He says, don't touch the mountain or you'll be stoned. And it came to pass on the third day in the morning that there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mount, and the voice of the trumpet exceeding loud, so that all the people that was in the camp trembled. And Moses brought forth the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Oak, because the Lord descended upon it at the nether part of the mount. And Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. And the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long, and waxed louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him by a voice. And the Lord came down upon Mount Sinai. The Lord called Moses up on the top of the mount, and Moses went up. Okay, so look at this. What do we have here? He comes down from heaven. He's wrapped in a cloud, like God was wrapped in cloud in Exodus 19. He was wrapped in fire, like he had feet as pillars of fire, like God came down as a pillar of fire in Exodus 19. You have a rainbow room. His face as it were the sun. If we kept reading in Exodus, you'd get to chapter 33 eventually, and you'd see in chapter 33 what happens. God says, no man can see me and live. So he hides Moses in the cleft of the rock, and then Moses' face shines. Now we could look at other examples. Jesus' face shown at the transfiguration. Jesus is glowing. Got all these things happening. But so I want you to, at least in your mind right now, accept as a theory that this angel is not an angel, but the angel of the Lord. The rainbow's on his head. So he comes down from heaven. This is Jesus, okay? Jesus comes down from heaven. And he had in his hand a little open book. And he set his right foot upon the sea and his left foot on the earth. And he cried with a loud voice as when a lion roared. And when he cried, 7 thunders uttered their voices. And of course, again, in Exodus 19, what came with God and lightnings? And when the 7 thunders had uttered their voices, I was about to write. And I heard a voice saying unto me, seal up those things which the 7 thunders uttered, and write them not. So he says, look, you're writing these things down. John's preparing to write these things down. And then God says, no, don't write it down. Because even now, I'm not telling you everything. Isn't that a useful piece of humility for us? To realize that there are some things that God has not revealed to us. There are no clues for me to tell you what the 7 thunders are. Bizarrely, you can find some commentaries that will guess what the 7 thunders are. But the whole point is that it wasn't written down because God conceals some things for himself. Jesus said, you don't know the day or the hour. But there's more than that. God is not obligated to give us every detail of... God's not obligated to give us every detail of our own lives, as I'm sure all of us have learned. These 7 thunderings, these things that accompany the presence of God, are hidden from us. And so, this is an area for me to go off on a little tangent. There are some people who say, we can't know anything about God. The agnostics. They say, maybe there's a God, maybe there's not a God. Even if there were, we couldn't understand. And then there are some people who have got extremely elaborate theological systems. And in their extremely elaborate theological systems, they think that they've got everything figured out. I've got some friends who are have particular beliefs about who's saved and why, and I think that oftentimes they have got it down to such a precise science that they forgot that there's a living God who is in charge of it all. And so they would say that they believe that God's free and sovereign, and then I'm the one that doesn't think that. But they have everything systematized down to a needle point. You can't really do that either. So somebody who says we can't know anything about God is wrong. And then somebody who says, well, I know everything about God is also wrong. What I think is really interesting here in Revelation is that God reveals some things to us and some things he doesn't. The agnostic would be right that we can know very, very little about God if God hadn't told us. That sounds kind of pious, right? To say, God's just so big. If there is a God, then that God comprehend it. And people say that, and some people think, okay, that sounds reasonable. But it is not reasonable. Because if God is all-powerful and all-wise and all-good, then he is beyond our comprehension, but he is not too weak to communicate with us. God doesn't tell us everything, but when God tells us something about himself, we can know it truly. And that means that as you read through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, you find out more things about God as you go. That throughout history, God revealed more of himself, and ultimately revealed himself supremely in Christ. But the things that God revealed about himself to Abraham were still true. They weren't the whole picture, they were still true. God reveals himself to us truly, although not completely. God reveals his plans to us truly, but not completely. So sometimes you say, well, I know that God is not going to give me every little detail of my life. And so we start to live in some kind of chaos. But there are actually lots of things that God has revealed to us. The book of Proverbs is all about how we can predict with a lot of accuracy how certain decisions will affect our lives. The borrower's slave to the lender, the rich slave to the poor. Go to the ant, you sluggard. If you live a certain way, there are certain predictable consequences. Whatsoever a man sows, so also shall he reap. Further, even though God is not necessarily going to give you a skywriter that says, hey, this is the job that I want you to select, he does say in the book of James, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God that gives to all men liberally and upbraideth not, doesn't find fault. So God does not reveal everything to us in every detail, but he gives us the principles he wants us to live our life by. And he gives us wisdom to make the right decisions when we come to those moments if we'll ask him. In the big picture, God does not reveal what these seven thunders are and what they mean. And so, as I've told you before, I think anybody who comes to a level of detail in their study of Revelation where they say, clearly this is a helicopter or something like that, are assuming that they know a lot more than God has revealed. But that doesn't mean God hasn't revealed anything to us. So sometimes I think people with Revelation in particular get lazy. They say, well, we can't know, so I'm not going to try. But I think God rewards the hard work of studying his word, of prayerful examination, of seeking for wisdom, both in our understanding of the Bible and in our personal lives. And so I wanted to use this as kind of a segue to remind us that God reveals a lot to us. I know some of you right now are in between jobs with how low the price of oil was last year. I know it's affected a lot of people. We all have friends that live up north somewhere, even in Arkansas or Oklahoma, that are complaining about how expensive gasoline is right now. And I know a lot more people here who are grateful that they may be able to get their jobs back because of all the things that were shut down. But so you and I here living in this area have got maybe a different perspective on it. But you may be at a position right now where you've got to decide, am I going to go back to my old company? Am I going to go to a different company? Am I going to go to a new field? I told you earlier that there's somebody I've been praying for and working with who is having some serious marital problems. They don't know what things are going to look like in their marriage. They don't know how they're going to work through these things. I know some of you are facing just health problems where you don't know, okay, what tests am I going to get? What test results am I going to get? Or maybe you already know a diagnosis and you don't know what your prognosis is, and the doctors can guess, but only God really knows. And so we can look at all those things and we can get so caught up in what God has not told us. And we can pursue trying to understand every detail. And I'm so guilty of this. I'm a planner and I want to understand before it gets here. It's just my temptation is to want to wrap everything up and comprehend it all. And I think that if we fixate on the seven thunders that we don't know, figuratively, then we miss all the things God has revealed to us. So in those different examples, what has God revealed to us? Well, he's revealed to us, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. He's revealed to us, I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor a seed begging for bread. He's revealed to us that I'm with you always, even to the end of the world. And so, I don't know what things are going to look like for our church 6 months from now. There are a lot of people that I had hoped would be back in church that are not. There are a lot of other people, follow that up. There's a lot of other people that I understand why they're not back. I understand why some people are not. But I just mean that I would like to, if you'd asked me a year ago what things would be like right now, I would not have guessed that things are going to be like this. But I know that Jesus said, on this rock I'll build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Not that AMBC will always exist, but rather this institution God established will never fail, that his gospel marches on. And so I just think it's really important for us to say, I trust God. I trust that even though he does not reveal every fine detail to me, that I can trust what he does tell me, and that that's enough. You remember a few months ago, it was not a few months ago, about a year ago, we were studying the life of John the Baptist. And when we came to where John the Baptist is in prison, The scripture says that John received word that the blind were seeing, the deaf were hearing, that the good news was preached to the poor. And so he sends his messengers to go and ask Jesus, say, Jesus, are you the one that should come, or should we look for another? So are you really the Messiah? I hear about all these wonderful things you're doing, but I can't help but notice that I'm still in prison. And what did Jesus say to John, to John's messengers? He said, go and tell John, the lame walk, the deaf hear, the dumb speak, and good news is preached to the poor. Jesus sent John's messengers back to tell John the things John already knew. That's why John sent the messengers in the first place, because he'd already heard those things. Jesus sent him back with the message, sent the messengers back to John with the message, reminded of what he already knew. It's Peter who wrote, to write the same things to you is not grievous to me, and it's helpful for you. Sometimes we just need everything, but I know him. He's told me who he is, and that's enough. I don't need to know what the seven thunders are, because I've read the back of the book and we win. I know that whether from death or through death, that God delivers again. And I just think that that's such a powerful thought. I'll give you one more illustration of that before we move on. You remember when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were about to be thrown into the fiery furnace. They said, our God is able to deliver us. And we know that he did deliver them. But what did they say right after that? But even if he doesn't, we'll never bow to your idols, O king. We know that God can deliver us, but even if he doesn't, he hasn't revealed his plan of what he's going to do with my health or my job or my family or my church. But he has revealed enough of who he is that I can trust him. We don't yet see all things put under his feet, but we see Jesus. So, okay. Sorry, I know that was an extended tirade, but that just, as I'm thinking about this and thinking about, okay, here, even in Revelation 10, there are things that God still keeps in his own power. It's extremely important. But I want to look with you in Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 8. Here we have this book. He says, but thou, son of man, hear what I say unto thee. Be not thou rebellious like that rebellious house. Open thy mouth and eat that I give thee. So God's speaking to Ezekiel, and he says, Ezekiel, open your mouth. I'm going to feed something to you. And when I looked, behold, a hand was sent unto me, and lo, a roll of a book was therein, a scroll. And he spread it before me, and it was written within and without, and there was written therein lamentations and mourning and woe. So now this is not an angel. This is God himself holding out a scroll to Ezekiel. And he says, Ezekiel, I want you to eat this. And it's written all over. And it's written all over with horrible things that are going to happen. But nothing's revealed to us specifically. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, eat that thou findest. Eat this roll, and go speak unto the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he caused me to eat that roll. And he said unto me, Son of man, cause thy belly to eat, and fill thy bowels with this roll that I give thee. Then I did eat it, and it was in my mouth as honey for sweetness. That's important, right? He eats this, and it's got bitter words on it, but it's sweet like honey in his mouth. What did we see here? He's got this book, and then as we read a minute ago, when he eats the book, he says, take it and eat it up, and it will make your belly bitter, but it shall be in your mouth sweet as honey. So again, God gave this to Ezekiel, and certainly here it seems to be tied up with God here as well. And of course, as you probably noticed, as I did midway through reading that, I meant to have you go to Daniel 12, not Ezekiel yet. Time for more coffee. Daniel 12, he says, you have these judgments that are coming. And then in Daniel 12 it says, and at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. So remember, Michael is the angel who represents the Israelites. He's their representative. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And he says, at this point, Michael's going to stand up, and there will be this time of trouble. Now we know this time of trouble, the time of Jacob's trouble, is the tribulation period. Remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. So it's the time where God is judging Israel. And at the end of this period, everyone will be saved whose name is found written in the book. Now remember, Paul said in Romans that at the end of the tribulation period, all Israel shall be saved. That is, that everyone who survives the tribulation period will come to faith. All the Israelites that survive will come to faith. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting shame and contempt. So at the end of this period, all those are delivered that had come to faith among the nation of Israel, but countless people who had died before are dealt with here too. They awake, some awake to everlasting life, that's those who know Christ, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. I don't want to get off in the weeds here, but I will say that those who believe in what's called annihilationism, that hell is temporary, have to struggle with the fact that the same word is used here of everlasting life and everlasting shame. Okay? And shame here, to me, implies consciousness, that once the books have been opened and we see our lives, that those who are not forgiven, the only response they can have is shame. There's no, oh God, this isn't fair. When we see our lives and have seen the holiness of God, there's shame. If we are not ashamed of our sin now, it's either because we don't recognize the depths of our sin or the heights of God's glory. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever. So that those that are wise, those that lead people to God, will glow. You remember that the angel standing there, his face shone like the sun? I suspect that this is, again, a reference to that these are those who lead. But when we see that the one who ultimately came to seek and save the lost shines like the sun. He says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. He says, so seal this for now. Then I looked, and behold, there stood other two, the one on this side of the bank of the river, and the other on the other side of that side of the bank of the river. So you've got a river, and you've got angels on either side. And one said to the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, how long shall it be to the end of these wonders? You have Jesus here, I think, standing on the waters. And I might even go as far as to say that when Jesus walked on the water, his point was not just to show his domination over nature, but to prophetically show that he is this man from Daniel chapter 12. So he's standing on the waters, and they say, how much longer will this last? And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the rivers of the water, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever. Now, this is interesting. Remember, because in Revelation 10, he stands on the sea and on the earth, and he holds up his hand to heaven, and he swore by the one who lives forever and ever. But he swore that time should be no more, that when the seventh angel begins to sound, the mystery of God should be finished. It says that the time's up. But here, in Daniel's day, he says, he that lives forever and ever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half, 3.5 years. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So he says that there is this period where Israel will be broken down. The power of the holy people will be broken so that all those that are written in the book will be saved. That's true of us, right? That we sometimes have to get beat down to the brink before we'll turn and look up. And remember, the Antichrist is given authority over the elect for a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years earlier in the book of Daniel. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. It says, don't try to understand it all, because it's sealed until it gets here. Similar to the thunders. Many shall be purified and made white and tried. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Okay, so now, let me show you 1,290 days. Whoops. And we're gonna the 1,290 days. Oh, let me divided by 3.5. It's 368. So about 3.5 years plus a little. So he puts this a time, times, and half a time, right? 3.5 years. Specifically, this period, 1,290 days. So it is from that time that the daily sacrifice is taken away. The Antichrist reveals himself, sets himself up, pretends to be God in the midst of the temple. We're going to read about all that in Revelation going on. He says, this is how much time is left. Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the end of the 1,305 and 30 days, 1,335. We'll talk about that to the extent that I have any comprehension of it at all later. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt find rest, and stand in thy lot at the end of days. So he says, Daniel, you don't worry about it, you rest. All right, I know we've only got 10 more minutes, so let's try to pull this together some. He seals it, and this angel, once the 7 thunders are sealed, stands on the sea and on the land and lifts up his hand to heaven and swears by the one who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea, and things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. This is that you don't have to wait anymore. Time's up. But in the day of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he hath declared to his servants the prophets. Now, what do we mean when we say, okay, no more waiting, and yet we know that at this point, it certainly seems like, if we take Revelation chronologically, which I do, I think that the heaven scenes are set off slightly, kind of go backwards, but I, as I've told you before, for various reasons, think that the seals are first, and then the trumpets, and then the bowls. Some people think that there are all these different ways of describing the same thing. I think that to get there, you have to be willing to ignore what the text says about the percentage of people that are dying and things like that. Because obviously a third of the people dying and a half of the people dying are not the same thing. So I think that they're more or less successive. And so to me, this can't really mean that the end is here yet. Rather, it means that once the 7th angel begins to sound, that the 7th angel's sound lasts through to the end. So remember, I think that the 7th seal contains the 7 trumpets, and I think the 7th trumpet contains the bowls of wrath. And so when this begins, that's it. And one of the reasons I think that is because back in Exodus 19, you remember it said that the trumpet held a long blast? So I think that's what we're getting here. And when that's done, these things that are hidden, the mystery of God, these seals that are, these thunders that are hidden, the stuff Daniel said was sealed up until the time of the end, it's all over. There will be a day when God will declare what he has shown his servants, the prophets, even though it's not yet. That's interesting and important too. God hasn't revealed everything to us yet, but when we die and when we're with him, we've got forever and ever to have all those things answered. And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again, and said, Go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel which stands upon the sea and the earth. And I went unto the angel. Remember, I think this is Jesus. It was God that gave the the scroll to Ezekiel, and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. So I suspect that this sweet as honey was because it's God's word. Your word is like honey, Psalm 119 says. It's bitter because Ezekiel told us that it was written with lamentation and woe. So it was a tough pill to swallow, and yet it's pleasure to him and it's delight to him to have God's word, even when it's bad news. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey. And as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. Then he said unto me, okay, last verse, and I've got 5 minutes. He said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. He says, okay, time's up. Then he says, but you need to go and preach. And this seems really strange, doesn't it? Verse 11 seems to come out of nowhere until you look back at Ezekiel 3. Okay, so the Son of Man eats the roll. He goes and speaks to the house of Israel. Okay? John, because Jesus has come and he's rejected as the Messiah, and he says, all power in heaven and earth is given unto me, so go and preach to all nations. Remember, Jesus, during his earthly ministry, gave the limited commission, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But now, in his risen ministry, he's ascending up to heaven. He says, all power in heaven and earth is mine, and so all the nations are mine, and so I send you to go and preach the gospel to all nations. So Ezekiel preached to the house of Israel, and he was appointed... verse 4, as a watchman on the wall. It says, Go speak to the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. For thou art not sent to a people of strange speech and hard language, but to the house of Israel. Not to many people of a strange speech and of a hard language, whose words thou canst not understand. Surely, had I sent them to them, they would have hearkened unto thee. He said, God says, look, I'm not sending you somewhere where you're going to have to learn a foreign language. I'm not sending you on the mission field. He says, I'm sending you to your own people. If I'd sent you to some foreigners, then they would listen. But the house of Israel will not hearken unto thee, for they will not hearken unto me. For all the house of Israel are impudent and hard-headed and hard-hearted. He says, they won't listen to you because they won't listen to me. Behold, I have made thy face strong against their faces, and thy forehead strong against their foreheads. As an adamant harder than flint have I made thy forehead. Fear them not, neither be dismayed at their looks, though they be a rebellious house. Moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto thee receive in thine heart, and hear with thine ears, and go. Get thee to them of the captivity, and unto the children of thy people, and speak unto them, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, whether they will hear, or whether they will forbear. You see what is happening? God says to Ezekiel, you go and you preach my word. They're not going to listen to you, but who cares? It's bitter, but it's sweet in your mouth. He says, it doesn't matter if they listen or not. What matters is that you're faithful to tell. And I think this is important. He goes on, he calls him a watchman on the wall. He says, look, if you don't warn them, then their blood is on your head. If you warn them and they don't listen, their blood's on their own head. Here's what I think this means for us in the context of Revelation 10. God has revealed some things to us and withheld other things. John was given this ministry of going and preaching to many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. We're given this job, the Great Commission, go ye therefore. We don't know who is going to respond in faith and who's going to be hard-headed. We don't know what those 7 thunders hold. We do know, though, that our role is to be obedient. That it ought to be sweet in our mouth even if it makes us sick to our stomach because the people reject. And so here, he's prophesying not just about the lost sheep of the house of Israel, but about the whole world. And when we get to chapter 11 and we see the 2 witnesses that are preaching, we see all these things that begin to happen, the temple given over to the Gentiles for a time, times and half a time, 3.5 years again, we're going to see that God is drawing people to himself from all over. And that as we see this, we see that some reject, most reject, but that's not our business. Our business is to be faithful. So how do we hold these different tensions that we've been talking about in place? I don't think that I can give you much more detail than to say that we take the word which God gives us and we're faithful to it, that we have his word in our mouth and on our lips, that we're obedient to what he's told us to do no matter what it is, that even though he hasn't revealed everything to us, he's revealed to us who he is when he sent his son to die on a cross in our place. That the one who remembers the promises that he's made and keeps the promises that he's made is the one that we know holds tomorrow in his hands. And so things may be rough. The world may be falling to pieces. I meant to mention that we need to pray. Brother Paul called me and said he talked to Brother Johnson in Myanmar or Burma. I don't know which one I'm supposed to call it. And all the violence that's taking place there and the effect it's having on their ministry there, and even things in the U.S. You saw the just the ongoing violence going on in different places. We see it feels like the world is falling apart, and we wonder, how is this going to work out? And God says, that's not your problem. Your problem is to speak my word, whether they're hard-headed or whether they listen. That's good advice for us. And I know that in Revelation, up to this point, you've been with me as we've looked all over, crisscrossed through the Bible, and tried to decipher some of these symbols and pictures, and even doing that a little bit in Revelation 10. It seems to me that the main idea John is making in this chapter is that there are some things we can't know. When we can't see his hand, like the song says, we can trust his heart. If you have any questions about any of this, then please let me know. Remember to like and share and comment on this video because all those things help us to get it in front of more people. If you have any questions, I'm not going to give you a lot of confidence that I understand anything more. I've told you about all that I understand about this passage, but I'll do my best. And next week we'll pick up Revelation 11. Remember, Sunday morning, John Rains is going to do the section in 1 Peter 5 on the church life, and then I'll finish out 1 Peter next week as we've been thinking about what it means to be in exile. Sunday nights we're continuing the devotionals we do on dailychapter.org, where I write a devotion on a chapter of the Old Testament every day. We are making good progress on that as well. So please keep up with that. Join us then, and God bless you. And have a great evening. We will see you soon.
Let me tell you the story of how I've been set free. I'm giving God all the glory, for he has rescued me. He saved my soul from